They were on a 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. I wonder why they went. Was it time to see family? Were they returning after the Passover and then ended up staying through the tragic events of what we now call Good Friday, when the one whom they had thought would be the one to redeem all of Israel ended up on a Roman cross? Were they going home because things were feeling kind of hot in the city, like more bad things might happen? I wonder. Actually, did more bad things happen? Was there a rumbling in the air, a threat of violence? Did they increase security with even more Roman soldiers around important buildings in the wake of the killing of Jesus Christ? Were there patrols marching up and down the streets, keeping the peace, or Pax Romana, as it was called back then, a relative peace that was kept for hundreds of years, but kept by keeping other people down? I wonder. And these two, Cleopas and the other, how close were they to the action? Did they know Jesus personally? Did they know the 12 disciples? Or were they one of the ones who came out to listen whenever Jesus was around? Had they followed him into Jerusalem from one of the smaller towns? Were they a part of the parade that had ushered Jesus into town before the Passover? Did they discover Jesus that day or before that? Or did they see this other parade, the one coming in from the other part of town, not the Roman parade that was bringing in the extra troops to keep the peace during the Passover, but the ridiculous parade with the donkey from the opposite side of town? Did they see that and wonder what was going on and join the movement then? I wonder. Did they see Jesus in the spaces around the temple with all the people selling grains and doves and pigeons and goats? And the closer you got to the temple, the more expensive these things got. These items that were necessary to present for sacrifice, sort of the way that you got in, whole and unblemished, otherwise they wouldn't be considered worthy, which also meant that the people who offered them would not be considered worthy. Did they see him turning over the temple tables, the tables of the money changers, yelling about not making his father's house a den of thieves? I wonder. And what was the moment? When did they hear something that made them think that this was the one who would redeem all of Israel? What made them believe and fall in line with Jesus, the Christ? And what did they think that redemption for Israel was going to look like? I wonder. I wonder if out on that 7-mile road, probably took 3 hours or so, I wonder about the whole of that conversation, if they were rehashing the details. Were they together the whole time, these two, during all these events that had taken place? Or did they have different tales to tell about where they were and what they saw and who they were with and what they heard and who was there and how they were processing the whole experience? Did they have a different idea about what had happened, different ways of interpreting the actions of the last few days? Did some call it murder and others call it punishment fit for whatever they thought Jesus had done? Were there those who were at this time saying that Pilate and the other authorities were just doing their jobs? Did everyone agree that it was the chief priest who had handed him over to the authorities? Was there some question about why they had done that? Were there people who agreed that the decision to hand him over and convince the Roman authorities to stop this man who was causing riots and outside the temple walls and inciting the people? Because those things aren't keeping the peace, and keeping the peace is the most important thing. So silence anyone who starts to rise up or uses tactics that don't match the keeping the peace. There must have been, right? Because someone was yelling, "Crucify him," down there in that courtyard when Pontius Pilate was trying to figure out what to do with this silent man in the courtyard. I wonder. And then a stranger is walking up next to them. He asks what they are talking about as they walk along, and they can't believe. Is he the one person in all of Judea who does not know that these things that have taken place, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth? And then this stranger starts to speak. And when he speaks, he's telling them things, teaching them new ways of understanding words that they have heard for so long, words from their own scriptures, probably pulling from Isaiah, words that talk about how God is always redeeming the world and what that must look like. Maybe he asked them to think about what they read in Isaiah 53 and how they think about that. And what if this stranger suggested to them that maybe this Jesus of Nazareth was the one they were talking about in that scripture? Or maybe he said something like, what do you think is spoken about in Isaiah 53? And even if it meant something different to the people who first read the book of Isaiah, what might it mean for us today out here on this road to Emmaus? And if you think about that, what might it mean for us today in our time? But back to that road. Maybe Jesus asked them, who do you think is the one who bears our sickness spoken about in Isaiah 53? Who is the one who looks like this normal guy, in fact, is despised and rejected by others, and then oppressed and afflicted, struck down but not defeated? Who is the one who did not open his mouth? Who is Isaiah talking about when he says that by a perversion of justice he was taken away and led like a lamb to the slaughter? Listen to the words that they might have heard that day out on the road. Words from Isaiah 53, their own holy scripture, and also ours. Who has believed what has been heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of a dry ground. He had no form of majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own ways, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was not oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that goes before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he is taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoils with the strong. Because he poured out himself in death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sins of many and made intercessions for the transgressors. Isaiah 53. Maybe these two out on the road, maybe they were hearing these words and hearing, when you make his life an offering of sin, through him the will of God will prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. The righteous one, my servant, shall be make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. And maybe their hearts began to stir with new understandings of what was happening, a different lens to view these texts, and how to make sense of the tragedy and the trauma that the whole community had just suffered, the violence they were in the midst of enduring, the chaos of the last few days. Maybe they were coming to understand that God was working even through this heinous act. Maybe their whole brains were flipping over because they came to make new sense of the events of the last week, learning how God was still active and that all hope was not lost. And soon they would stop for the night in this town called Emmaus. And they would invite this stranger to stay with them because it was getting dark and the roads aren't all that safe at night, especially given all the events of the last couple of days and all the chaos that was still around. And he sat down to eat with them. And this stranger picked up the bread and broke it and gave it to them, and their eyes were opened. As soon as that happened, it was all over. He was somehow gone, but they knew it had happened. And now they had a new thing to talk about and process as they asked the question, were not our hearts burning within us when he was opening the scripture to us while we were out on that road? And what about that story the women told us about the tomb? We didn't believe them when they said it, that it was empty, thought they were making things up. But what if it's true? What if he appeared to them and has now appeared to us too? That hope was not only not lost, but was walking alongside us and still teaching and still showing the way, risen. They were so excited about this that even though it was dark, and even though it probably wasn't safe, and even though they had just walked those 7 miles, they went back out and walked back to Jerusalem to find the disciples still gathered in that upper room and to told them about all that they had seen and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The stories of the resurrection are full of things to wonder about, and that's how we'll explore during this season of Easter. We'll wonder together. We'll wonder about the stories and also wonder how God is still active in our own lives, how God might be walking alongside us, still teaching, still showing the way, even though we may not always recognize that that is what is happening. How God might be revealed as we listen to one another, look around the world, and approach the world with curiosity and wonder. God is still speaking. Resurrection is always happening. Let's wonder about it together.